keep you waiting. My name is Izzy Greenberg. Welcome to the Childcare for CT December monthly meeting. I can't believe we've made it to December that fast. This year went extremely quickly for me. Welcome. I hope your night is going well. We have 1 hour meeting. We've got a lot to cover, so I'm going to get right into it. We are going to not have time to do in-person introductions, so I'm hoping that everyone can please put your name and where you're from in the chat, and maybe just one thing that made you happy today, because that is always a wonderful way to have to do a night meeting. So if you could just put your name, where you're from. That could be the company you work for, if you're in a childcare space, or the town you're from, however you interpret that. I know that Maria was calling in from Dominican Republic, so maybe she'll put that. Okay, actually, let's start interpretation. Is Sandra here?
Because we redid it, we're having the same problem as our provider call where she's in limbo. So I just texted her the link.
All right.
Yeah, sorry. We're troubleshooting behind the scenes.
Deal with technical difficulties, but we have migrated all of our Zoom stuff from an old account to a new account, and it created some problems. And we've been trying to clean them up all week, unfortunately. I'm sorry, everyone. Ava, can you give that Spanish instruction then, just for folks so they know that it's coming?
Hola, bienvenidas, buenas noches. Por si acaso, vamos a tener interpretación como siempre. Cuando interpretación empieza, por favor, mira tu pantalla para el globo o los 3 puntitos que dice MORE, more, para más. De ahí, con esos 3 puntitos, escoge el idioma que tú prefieres, inglés o español. De ahí puedes activarlo y a cualquier momento, si tienes preguntas o dudas, puedes usar el chat CHAT en la pantallita para preguntar cualquier duda que tengas. Gracias. Izzy, back to you.
All right, great. Give me 1 second. Let me just get this code to Sandra. All right. All right, good. All right, well, then I'm sorry, but we will keep going, and anything missed, we'll make sure that we just get people caught up on. Okay, so I can see Sandra here, actually. Let's just get the interpretation going, and then we'll keep moving. And thanks, guys, for your patience. Somehow, there's always little glitches. Even as much as every time we try to get it better and better and better. Okay, so I have just started interpretation. You should see language interpretation available pop up at the bottom of your screen. You can click the globe to choose either English or Spanish. And Ava, would you give that instruction in Spanish, please?
Hola, buenos días, buenas noches nuevamente. Por favor, escoge las 3 burbujitas para interpretación, la palabra MORE, más en tu pantalla, son 3 burbujitas, o puedes buscar ESP para activar la interpretación. Si tienes preguntas o dudas, por favor, usa el chat. Back to you.
Great, thank you. And so for anyone who didn't understand me earlier, if you could please put your name, where you're from, and something making you happy into the chat, so we can all have a little bit of introduction time right now. So, and welcome everyone. Thank you for being here. I'm Izzy Greenberg, and I do help with communications work for Childcare for CT. I'm going to be just running this because Ava's got other things she's going to present on, and we're just so happy to be here with you all tonight. Okay, we are going to jump right in. Ava's got a lot of information to share on some federal updates from a conference she was just at. So Ava, I'll just turn it over to you.
Awesome, thank you, Izzy. So the National Women's Law Center is a very well-respected national organization. They do some think tanking, so they have researchers as well as policy experts that really do deep dives on legislation, changes in the law that impact children, family, women, right? Everyday women. And because of the new administration that's coming in, they were able with their team to focus on what they anticipate those changes to be. So I just wanted to go into a rundown and, bear with me because it's a lot of information. And most of the information that we discussed last time in our last community meeting. But I wanted to make sure that we did an update with what we do anticipate and also set the stage as to why the federal legislation and changes matter, how that reflects on the fiscal guardrails that we see here in the state of Connecticut, and what do those two realities, right, the federal government, the state of Connecticut, and the guardrails, how does that impact our plan and what we want to do as a coalition to support workers, providers, and families? Okay, so last time we talked about certain threats. It was kind of like a conversation of maybe this will happen, we're not quite sure, and we were trying to paint a picture, but we didn't have all the information, and we definitely didn't have the power of the researchers from the National Women's Law Center, but now we do. Their team did a deep dive, and they went through the Trump administration from when he was president last time. They looked at all the policy and legislation that his administration put out. Some of those policy proposals didn't pass because the dynamic between Congress and the Senate was very different. Now that it's what they call trifecta, now that they have a Republican House, a Republican Senate, and a Republican administration, there's a lot more anticipation that things could happen that they want to happen. So things that we can see coming to hurt the child care system and early care system here in the state of Connecticut. So if you're a parent on the call, if you work in the child care space, or if you are someone an advocate who interacts with families, who interacts with children, what we could see right now is reduce funding for federal programs that have to do with children and family. We can also see coming down the pipeline deregulation of those child care programs and child care subsidies and programs that help and support families as well. We could also see programs that really support mothers who have newborns, as well as programs that really support providers in their workforce. To be more specific, programs like Head Start really require federal funding. Here in Connecticut, our subsidy program for low-income families who really need that assistance in care, it's Care for Kids. So those two programs are the most known to everyday people. And we anticipate a situation where there's no funding on the federal level, and they can also be unraveling those programs. So that means that here in Connecticut, we'd have to figure out how we can really lift them up and continue to support them. We'd have to find new funding here locally to fill the gaps that the feds don't want to fill. There's also threats on healthcare programs. Why, if we're a child care advocacy group, why does healthcare threats matter? Well, it matters if a lot of our workforce in early care and education really depend on their employer for healthcare. They really depend on the Access Health CT, like we call it Access Health CT, but the Affordable Care Act on the federal level to get their health insurance. So imagine a reality where overnight there is no Access Health CT funding from the feds, and the state of Connecticut again has to backfill, and there's no preventative care mandates anymore, and the workers who are in the early care system who depend on that really don't have that anymore, or the families that have young children that depend on those programs don't have those support systems. The other real threat that's coming down the line that the National Women's Law Center saw is the suspension and reduction of the federal spending power. So allowing the legislative body, so elected officials who represent you, me, us, right, no longer really taking a proactive opportunity to fill in those gaps and, pass out that money, and really getting into a scenario where the president-elect, soon to be president, will be calling the shots. And the other big bullet point that we wanted to highlight is the immigration and deportation conversation that's been happening with the soon-to-be administration as well. So if you're on the call and you're someone who's undocumented, or someone who is an immigrant with a visa, with a green card, I know this conversation is an emotional one. It's a difficult one. As a coalition, we're showing you love and support in this time of doubt, and this time of difficult conversations to have with your family. For those who are not undocumented, who are not from a family that has these kind of conversations in their home, please recognize that 20% of the child care workforce is made up of immigrants. From that 20%, 68% of them are women who are immigrants. So if we are not supporting our undocumented and immigrant population here in Connecticut, that means we are not supporting a good portion of our child care industry, not to mention the families who are going through hardship.
2-minute warning.
Awesome. I can wrap it up. So all of that was a little depressing. Those updates were a little scary. But there are recommendations and solutions on how we can move forward from the experts. The very good news is many of those recommendations are things that here in Connecticut we are already doing. And it's also recommendations and solutions that as a coalition, we've been really tackling and trying to put into practice with our policy proposal. And we'd be on the up and up. We'd be ready if, in fact, this administration is coming in and gutting programs, gutting policies that families depend on. As a coalition, we're already making the steps necessary for that administration and create a plan that really encompasses everyone. So I'm not going to read bullet point by bullet point. But I do want to pass it over to Logan, because, I gave you a little bit of the federal, what's happening federal, and now we want to talk about what's happening here in Connecticut. Kind of like, again, we're setting the conversation, and then we'll have Terra, our organizing director, talk about how that advocacy, how these two crises, right, the federal money and potential gutting, how Connecticut having a difficult time with our finances, how we could come together as a coalition and make sure that we're really focusing on a future that incorporates real solutions, transformational change, and something holistic. So I'll pass the mic over.
Great, and thank you. I think the one thing that is really remarkable when looking at this blue slide is how many of the recommendations coming from the experts are the things that are the most important to this coalition. So I just want to highlight that. I think it's a really important thing to call out, that basically every bullet point here is the stuff that this group has been working on. And so I feel like everyone here deserves just a little pat on the back for being forward thinking and knowing what we need to do to build the system that we need for our state. So just want to call that out before we move on. And thank you so much, Ava. Okay, so next presentation, we have Logan Place is here with us. He is an attorney with Livingston, Adler, Holda, Micklejohn, and Kelly. And I'm sorry, Sandra. He is here to talk to us about Connecticut's fiscal guardrails, which are a big deal, are going to impact everything that happens this legislative session, have a huge impact on our state and our state budget, and are really important for us all to understand going into this legislative session. So Logan, welcome. Thank you so much for being here. And I will let you have the floor and you can share your screen.
All right, thank you.
Actually, and just as a reminder for folks, I do have this slideshow in Spanish. I will put the link to the Spanish slideshow in the chat for folks. So sorry.
No, thank you all for having me. Yeah, so I'm going to give a presentation, and before I start, I just wanted to say a couple things. First, I cannot figure out a way to give this presentation in a way that is not extremely dry and boring. We're talking about like fiscal policy, and I find it deeply boring, but it's also very important. I apologize in advance if it gets a little wonky. I'll try my best to not do that. And the second thing is, this is really complicated stuff. I've been researching and into this for a couple years now, and I don't fully understand everything about the fiscal guardrails, or as you'll see, I call them fiscal barriers. And you don't need to understand everything about them or even everything I present today. What I hope you'll take away from it is the importance of needing to change them because they're really going to prevent progress on a number of issues, including childcare, if we don't find ways to change them or work around them. So with that, I will share my presentation. Okay, so I'm one of those people who believes that words really matter. So the term that it's commonly used is fiscal guardrails. We've been working to we as in a lot of organizations I work with have been trying to change that framework and call them fiscal barriers because guardrails sounds like a good thing, right? It protects us from running off the road, right? But really what these are is they're fiscal barriers. They're preventing us from moving forward. They're keeping us in place so that we can't move forward. So if you throughout this presentation, I'll be using fiscal barriers, but if you hear on the news or maybe some legislators will refer to them as fiscal guardrails. Or fiscal roadblocks. I'll say we've gone back and forth with those two quite a bit. But the fiscal roadblocks, in very brief, what they are is they're a set of rules that prevent elected officials from making necessary investments by arbitrarily limiting the amount of money the state can spend, even if we have a ton of money, right? So even if we have a surplus in revenue, or even if we raise additional revenue, right? So if we raise taxes, say we want to raise taxes on the ultra wealthy, right? That's great, but we can't spend it because of these roadblocks. There are many different types of fiscal roadblocks, but the ones I'm going to cover today are the most important ones. They're the constitutional spending cap, the statutory spending cap, the volatility cap, and then the bond lock, which kind of brings all of the statutory, at least the statutory roadblocks together. So just to paint the picture a little bit, since 2020, Connecticut has had approximately $20 billion in budget surpluses that we have not been able to spend to make necessary investments in our community. So that's a lot of money. And that doesn't even count if we were to, say, want to raise additional revenue, right? That's just with our current tax structure. That's how much budget surpluses we haven't been able to use. So key background on this is what it does is it restricts the state's ability to address social inequities as they existed in 1991, which is when the constitutional spending cap went into effect. Because the constitutional spending cap says is you can't spend more than you spent the previous year, except as adjusted for average income growth or inflation, right? So if we spent X amount last year, we can't spend more than X plus whatever inflation is the next year, right? So we can't ever decide that we want to make a new major investment unless we want to cut a current program. So this is obviously problematic because since 1991, right, which at the time there was already a lot of inequities, our economy's become more unequal, right? Connecticut has one of the most unequal states as far as based on race and based on class is one of the most unequal states in the country. Oops, sorry. So because of this, we're facing the service cuts. We have understaffing, wait lists. We're unable to invest in things like childcare, even though we're predicted to have plenty of revenue. Now, I'll admit, when I created this slide, it was before the last election. And as was just talked about, there's questions about what federal funding is going to look like and whether that's going to create actual budget deficits in the future if federal funding gets cut. But that's all the more reason that we need to adjust these because we're going to need to spend money to fill in those gaps if federal funding goes away. So again, I actually made this slide and used childcare as an example. I was actually giving the presentation to some folks who worked in higher education, but I thought childcare was a really good example. So this is an example of how the roadblocks prevent even fiscally responsible progress, right? And is very undemocratic. So say Connecticut decides it wants to invest in early childhood education, and elected officials look at the research and they deem it fiscally responsible because it's going to increase the current workforce, right? Because people have childcare and they can therefore go to work. And there's long-term benefits that will make it less likely that that child will rely on public assistance, which will create long-term savings for the state. So we decided this is an investment that actually is going to not just the right thing to do, but will actually save us money, and it's good for the economy. But do the roadblocks? The answer is no. The legislators that we elect can't do it. The only way they could do it would be by cutting the existing services or investment. So one of the big problems with all of the fiscal roadblocks, and this is common to all of them, is they change the normal rules of democracy. Legislators can't do what we all think of as democracy, right? Which is normally it passes both House and the governor signs it, or if the governor doesn't sign it, they can override it with a 2/3 if there's a veto. Under here, those rules no longer apply, and we'll get into why in a little bit. So what happens to that additional money? It goes into the budget reserve fund, which is often called the rainy day fund, which that's already full. And then it goes off to paying off pension debt and other debt. Now, I represent labor unions, including public sector unions. I don't think by itself paying off pension debt is a bad thing, right? But to use an analogy someone else used, right now we are up to date on our pension payments. We are in a good place. Have a plan to pay it off. We're making all of our payments. If your roof is collapsing and you're up to date on your mortgage, you don't make extra mortgage payments, right? You fix your roof. And that's where we really are right now with the community. Oh, and then the last thing on this side of the slide, I just want to say this might be relevant to some of your discussions, is that another common attribute is that revenue which never hits the general fund isn't subject to this. So that is a potential way around it. So if you were to create some sort of tax and that never went into the general fund, you would be able to spend that without that without that being subject to these rules. So I'm going to kind of, for time's sake, not go into the constitutional spending cap too much for a few reasons. First of all, it's probably the least of our concerns. It's also the hardest to change, and there's an argument that it's not even technically in effect right now. I won't get into all the legal reasons why, but I just want to point out what's here is number 4. Is at the time, basically this was created as a compromise in order for the state to get an income tax, right? And they cut a bunch of taxes for the rich, and then they wanted to make sure that the income tax wouldn't be used to address inequality, right, or social services. And so the current in their voting guide urged a really strict constitutional spending cap because otherwise, quote, no one would be surprised if the next legislature decides in 1993 that a lot more municipalities are distressed, especially if the then governor, as expected, proposes a major assault on urban poverty and decay. So it was very out in the open that the purpose of this was to prevent investments in communities that need them. And this is the language. Again, I'm going to skip this because we don't need to know all of it. But the important part here, and this will be relevant later, is it can't be increased greater than the percentage of increase in personal income or increase in inflation, unless the governor declares an extraordinary, an emergency or extraordinary circumstances and 3/5 vote in each house. But there was also some exemptions in here, and any additional money could be used not just for paying off pension, but anything else that each House of the General Assembly agreed on with a 3/5 vote. Those things go away a little bit later, as we'll get into. So in 2017, this is the really important one. There was the statutory spending cap. And that got rid of the 3/5 escape for spending surplus. It removed exemption for distressed municipalities, and it made it harder to use revenue intercept. And what I mean by revenue intercept is that little trick I talked about earlier. Not trick, but the way I talked about how you could get around it by if the money never hits the general fund, it's not subject. they changed the rules to make it a little bit harder to do that. Not impossible, but harder. So what are the impacts here? As fewer working families can afford education, we need more of it, yet we're investing less. As population grows, we need more engineers, teachers, social service workers, yet we're hiring fewer. And when we invest more in childcare, education, housing, and healthcare, we reduce needs for public services in the future, and produce more revenue. But because of the cap, we say you have to spend less. So the next one is the volatility cap. And again, the spending cap and the volatility cap are the two big ones. The volatility cap in principle is not a bad policy. The idea of the volatility cap is to say certain revenue that the state receives through taxes is volatile, right? So some years it can be more, some years it can be less. And because of that, we shouldn't have budgets that rely heavily on volatile sources of revenue because it'll create a budget deficit in years where it's a little bit lower, right? So in theory, that's not irrational, right? And other states have things similar to a volatility cap, but they do it much differently in ways that make much more logical sense. So why does ours not make sense? Well, what they did, first, what they determined was volatile is not largely correct. Some of these, in fact, are not as volatile as they thought, or at least the principle behind it, but it applies to capital gains, dividends, interest, and business pass-through taxes. Now, I think we all know who primarily receives income from from capital gains, dividends, interest, and business pass-through taxes. It's not most working class folks. So it's very clear that this is another way. You'll notice I used the monopoly man before, that this is another way to protect the ultra wealthy from tax increases, because if we want to increase taxes on these things, that's all well and good, but we can't spend it, right? So it's very difficult to get an increase in taxes on things like capital gains and dividends. But what's particularly egregious about the volatility cap is they just picked the number in 2017 and said, any amount above this number has to go into the rainy day fund or paying off debt. But that number wasn't based on any data, right? Like there wasn't public hearings on this, right? This was a backroom deal where they just kind of last minute picked a number in order to get a budget passed in 2017. So what doesn't make sense about it, right, is first of all, the number was arbitrary. So since then, every year we have been well above that 2017 number, often by over $1 billion. And also by making it a cash number instead of a percentage, it's completely arbitrary, because if the idea is that you want to protect volatile revenue, right, if you increase the percentage that you're taxing someone at, then that is should be the correct number, right? Not that whatever number existed. Conversely, if you were to lower it, right, you wouldn't want to keep it at that high level. So it should be based on percentage. In addition, the number that they chose was an incorrect one. They should have looked at historically what we received and averaged it or something along those lines. And most people agree now. I shouldn't say most people. Many people, even those who like the fiscal roadblocks, agree that the volatility cap is somewhat arbitrary and should be adjusted. Right. So I mentioned that we're always well above that number. So on average, it's been $1.4 billion per year above the amount that's set that we can't use. There was only 1 year since this went into effect that it was below $1 billion, and that was fiscal year 2020 during the beginning of COVID. And even then, we were still $900 million above what the cap we set. So why is this a problem? Well, again, it makes increasing taxes very difficult, particularly increasing taxes on the wealthy very difficult, because we can't spend that money. So it prevents tax reform prevents those investments. So we can raise it. It's easy to raise taxes on working families by majority rule, right? But to raise taxes on the rich, we effectively need a 3/5 vote from each house. So those last two are statutory. So you may say, Logan, that's really bad. How am I doing on time, by the way? I'm doing okay? All right.
Yeah, you're doing fine. You've got 13 minutes.
Okay. So you might say, well, that's great news, Logan. Those last two you talked about are statutory. So why can't the legislature just change them? That seems like an easy fix, right? If a lot of people want that, then shouldn't the legislature do that? Well, the problem is what's called a bond lock. So it's first happened in 2017. We had a budget crisis then, right? This is when the statutory spending caps went into effect. And in order to get a budget, and there was effective Republican control of the General Assembly, they did this thing where they basically promised bondholders, right? So people who own state bonds, primarily people on Wall Street investors, and in the bonds, right, when they issue the bonds, they promise that they will not change the fiscal roadblocks as they exist in 2017. Those expired, were about to expire. And then in 2023, there was another backroom deal where they basically pushed it through again and extended it they tried to extend it 10 years, but due to a lot of good coalition work in Connecticut with progressive organizations and labor unions, we were able to get it limited to an ability to get out of it after 5 years. So I want to think about this for a second, right? This is really anti-democratic, right? What it's saying is that we are going to bind future voters, future legislatures to what we decided in 2017 and then again in 2023, right? So no longer do the normal rules of democracy apply because we are going to put this into a bond and give that power to Wall Street, right? So there's no real rhyme or reason to it. There's certain situations where a bond promise makes sense when it's related to the bond, right? The ability to repay the bond. Here it doesn't, right? I mean, in theory, then they could put anything, right? Any piece of legislation that they don't want future legislators to change, they could put in a bond lock, which effectively creates a constitutional amendment. But they did that with a bare majority of the vote, as opposed to the supermajority that you would need in the long process you would need for a true constitutional amendment. So I know that's a lot right there. So just very simply, what the bond lock is it is a promise to bondholders, primarily Wall Street investors, that until 2020, at least 2028 now, they will not change any of the statutory fiscal roadblocks in effect. So what does that mean? Well, when we say we need to change these and do the necessary investments, legislators say, and the governor says, and other elected officials say, well, even if we wanted to, we can't because of the bond lock. I will say this, though. It's not entirely clear that the bond lock actually prevents them from doing this. Lamont has, under the bonds related to the teacher's retirement pension, has changed them anyways. It's not clear whether they would, whether bondholders would actually have standing to be able to sue, because they would need to show harm, and there's no real reason to think that they would be able to show any sort of harm by changing this. So I don't want to give into the idea that they can't do it because of the bond lock. I'm more saying that that many elected officials will say we can't do it because of the bond lock, but that's very different as to whether they actually can or can't. It's not, I don't actually buy that they can't. I think that there are ways around it, including there's a provision that says if they make adequate protection for bondholders, they can in fact go change the rules. So I gave a lot of bad news, but there is some good news. There are ways to change the volatility cap, even with the bonds lock. There are ways to do revenue intercepts, which I kind of mentioned, right? So that it never hits the general funds. And we can defame the bond locks as they exist for now, as I just mentioned, and then really eliminate it in 2028. Again, these are very anti-democratic and they're preventing the necessary investments. So 2028 is going to be a big year to make sure we make real change, but there are ways that we can at least minimize the negative impact until 2028. And we're in this together. So thank you. I think I was good on time. Yes, I went through that a little fast. If anyone has, I don't know if we open up to questions. I know that was
it's great.
a lot.
If you don't mind, we'd love to ask some questions.
Sure.
Yeah. All right. Well, let's say we're open to questions. I'm going to give it to Ava first to get us started. And then if other folks have questions, using the Q&A is the best place to do it, but you could also raise your hand.
My first question to get us started is what is a legal path forward on trying to undo some of these locks and caps?
Yeah, great question. So there's a few different possibilities. One is, right, the easiest way to do this, and I mean easiest legally, not politically, is for the governor to declare extraordinary circumstances or an emergency and a 3/5 vote in both houses. That has been done under this constitutional spending cap under multiple administrations in the past. And there's no reason why it couldn't happen right now. So that is one way to consider. That legally is completely sound. There's no issue with it. The big issue, right, is politically, because the Lamont administration so far has been very clear that he does not want to touch the fiscal roadblocks. Okay. So if we want to be a little bit more indirect, right, there's a few different ways. There's the revenue intercept, right? So having a tax, some sort of way where we get revenue, and that revenue doesn't touch the general fund, so it gets diverted directly to a program. The statutory spending cap made that a little bit more difficult, but and it's been a while since I looked at it, so I don't want to give the incorrect information, but I believe what it did is make it a little bit harder on like what those funds could be used for. The other way is to go through the bond lock and say, we're going to provide adequate protections for bondholders, and therefore we can amend the fiscal roadblocks as is. Those are primarily the ways. And then, of course, amending the volatility cap, which doesn't require going around the bonds at all. That's not a fix-all, because for two reasons. One is it can only help raise so much revenue, but the volatility cap and the statutory spending cap are two separate things, right? So if we fix the volatility cap, but don't fix the spending cap, we may be able to spend a little bit more money, right? Because the volatility cap isn't in the way, but the spending cap is still going to say you can't spend more than you spent last year, other than as adjusted for inflation. So that's only a partial fix that in some years may give us some extra money, but it's not going to be a huge fix.
Thank you, Logan. Ava, did you have another question?
No, it's a complicated situation to be in, and I do hope that people listening appreciate that. We don't want to baby anyone here. You know, we're childcare, so I can say things that are funny like that. We don't want a baby. Everyone's an adult, and I think it's fair to take this information and learn and grow and understand a little bit more about policy and how our money works in Connecticut. Because when we throw out ideas of what we could do, we should be very informed on how to really tackle our next steps as a coalition. And that means parents, providers, and advocates all together being informed.
Yeah. Yeah. And I don't want to miss also saying that we've had Representative Khanna and Senator Kushner both here today. I know tonight rather, these are going to be tough things for our lawmakers to have to wrestle with. This is hard for us to imagine a pathway forward, but appreciative of those who are in the trenches actually having to manage this. So thank you both for being here, but also, thank you to everyone for being here. This is hard for everyone, no matter which perspective you come at it from, but it's great to have lawmakers join us here today. Okay, let's see. Any other questions before we wrap this part up? Last call. Oh, Q&A here. Do we know of another state that has the same problem, and have they successfully changed it?
I don't want to say that there aren't states with the same problem. There are certainly states that have things similar to the volatility cap. I know that, but theirs is just done in a more intelligent way. I'll have to get back on whether if there's other states with the exact same problem. I will have to get back on that unless someone else. Does anyone here else know that?
You are welcome to raise your hands, folks, if you do.
Was mostly looking at Julie.
Well, from the National Women's Law Conference, they pointed out states that had surpluses, but I'm not sure about the volatility cap. So one example is Georgia has a surplus. I think they're 18 billion right now. And their governor is just sitting on the money and not wanting to spend it, similar to here. But I don't know if they have a volatility cap. Yeah.
There's another question here from Dylan that with the new, and I believe that this question is in reference to this can be changed by the governor in an emergency. I think that's what this is in reference to, but the question is, with the new federal administration and the threat to childcare, would it suffice to say that dismantling Head Start would count as an emergency?
I would say so. I don't know if Lamont will say so. Yes, I look, there's no, to my knowledge, there's no definition of extraordinary circumstances or emergency. That's really up to the governor and the legislature's discretion. It's been used in the past in situations where we've had budget issues. So yes, particularly if we're facing big federal spending cuts, yes, it's absolutely could be done and should be done. In fact, even without the changes in the federal government, I would say we were already in a state of emergency just because there's a lot of people struggling right now and we have the money, right? There are people who don't have childcare. There's people who can't make ends meet while we are in an extremely wealthy state in an extremely wealthy country. I think that's an emergency, right? We have the money to fix things and we're not doing it. But it's really about political pressure and getting the Lamont administration to see that that we're in an emergency and we could be in an even worse emergency depending on how federal funding happens.
Yeah, right. Thank you. Melissa is saying, thank you for this very helpful information. Are there fact sheets, one-pagers, graphics, other resources we can share with members of our communities, acknowledging that we want and need to be informed with the details and would also like to be helpful in sharing high-level information using accessible language?
I will.
You have that, or you know of any?
Yes, but I don't have it. I didn't think to bring it with me. So can I email it to you all and you can distribute it?
Absolutely. That is something that we can share out after the fact, along with any of these presentations. So as long as you're comfortable with that, we'll also share your presentation for folks who weren't able to be here tonight.
Can I just respond to the
yes,
last question that was in the chat?
Yeah, can I just ask it? I'll ask it out loud for folks, because the chat doesn't always show up in the recording. There's another question here. As I understand our fiscal situation, these guardrails, roadblocks in Connecticut were adopted because the legislature failed to make payments towards our teachers' state employees' pension obligations. Is this right? That question's from Greg.
Yes. So not entirely. So when the state failed to make the pension payments, that was a really long time ago. Okay. And that was prior to unions even bargaining the pension plan. In fact, once CBAC, State Employee Union, started bargaining the pension plan, they created sorry, I think childcare, so I hope it's okay. My toddler's yelling, but that actually created the contractual obligation. That's when they started actually paying into it. So there is an unfunded liability, but that is from decades and decades ago. The statutory ones went into effect in 2017. There was a budget crisis going on, but that wasn't directly tied to the pension plan. So we did have a debt issue, right? That is largely corrected. And I'll let Senator Kushner add on because you have much more knowledge on this than I do.
Senator, welcome.
If you don't mind, I mean, I've been talking about this for the last, I don't know, years. It seems to me that the failure to make pension payments, and it went way into much later even though there were, once the unions bargained, there were obligations, they still didn't make their full payments, like minimum, it's called a minimum payment that they have to make to meet their liability, potential liability. They didn't do it for decades and decades and decades. Really, under Malloy, it started getting like much more like we're going to pay up now. And what happens is the calculation of how much is owed each year includes that past liability. So when Logan said we're making current payments, we are, because the minimum payment we make today includes the cost of not paying for decades. What the legislature has been doing is making additional payments on top of that when we have these surpluses, which helps to pay down the debt. It does mean that it gives us, several $100 million of extra spending each year, because we're, because we are not carrying as much debt. It reduces the debt payment. But yeah, I think, Logan, your remarks about you don't, pay down your mortgage when you have a leaking roof is a really good way to look at it, because especially we have a rainy day fund with $4.1 billion in it, and it's raining outside. So why are we paying down our debt unnecessarily when it's raining outside and we have a hole in the roof? So I thought that was a really good analogy. The thing I would say is that in 2017, it really had nothing to do with the debt or with, the economics of the situation. If you go back to 2017, that's before I got there. But what happened in 2017 is we had a split Senate. We did not have a majority Democrats in the Senate, and we could not get a budget deal that year between the House and the Senate and the governor. They couldn't make a deal. And the way the deal was struck was by putting in more stringent fiscal guardrails that the Republicans then would come to the table and make a deal. And that's really that, as I understand it, it was much more a political situation in 2017 than a fiscal crisis.
Yeah.
And I don't think the pension is the reason for it anymore, because we've done so much to fix that.
Yeah. Thanks so much, Senator. And thank you so much, Logan. We are at time for this part of the presentation, and really grateful for all of that detail. We would love to share out this presentation and any documents that you can get to us in the email that we'll send after this meeting. Ava, I'll call on you, and then we're going to go to Terra. Thanks again, Logan.
Thank you. I'm gonna shout out to Maria Reyes's comment in the chat, because a perfect caveat for our next segment before we close. So Maria Reyes asked, how does this situation affect childcare? She's concerned. So today's presentation, and thank you so much, Logan, was really setting the stage on the federal level, on the state level of where we are with our finances, what we anticipate will happen with money coming in or no money coming in, and as a coalition, how we can plan and create a legislative proposal that could fix childcare, could fix this crisis. So I'm going to pass it over to Terra Volpe, our organizing director, who's going to do a conversation, get us started with our field plan for 2025. And for next community meeting, January, we are going to present a plan of how are we going to do this? How are we going to figure out a way to fund childcare, considering the fiscal barriers. Logan, hopefully you're proud, the fiscal barriers, and support families. So Terra, I'll pass it to you.
Thank you so much. So I'm not sure if everyone of you if I've been in a meeting with you yet, but if you have or if you haven't, I just want to say again how very excited I am to be part of this community. So I'm going to attempt to do a share. We had a little glitchiness. Let's see if this works. If it doesn't, don't worry. We have a backup plan, but we don't need one. All right, beautiful. So I also have a little bit of a cold, so I apologize. Izzy, this is the wrong one.
That's okay. You can stop your share and do the other one. Do you want me to share for you, or would you prefer to?
I feel like it disappeared. Hang on. Can you share for me, Izzy?
No problem. Yeah, you start talking and I'll work on getting your presentation up. No
So I want to run through with you tonight a couple of things. I want to talk to you about power, and I want to talk to you about things that we can do together, and I want to talk to you about stretching. So I do have a couple of fun facts in my presentation because I do love fun facts. And one of the first slides that you'll see, you're going to see a person with just a single person. And then, yeah, thanks, Susie. Actually, right there. Perfect. Stay right there. Go back one. Go back one. Amazing. So I live by this. When people engage in political advocacy and get others involved, change can happen. You, the people, you are the muscle behind the movement. Next slide, please. Thank you so much. So when I think about people engaging in change work, I know as well as everybody else here that one person can really do something. If you bring a few more people with you, you have more hands, more capacity, and more power. And then when we have this collection of lots and lots of people, that is when we can really maximize our power. And just knowing that is really important as we work through this session. Next slide, please. So fun fact number one, legislators like being legislators, and they understand that happy constituents are directly related to keeping their jobs. And they also know that, well, we also know that lots of unhappy constituents can make legislators nervous. So just always a little something to keep in your back pocket. Next slide, please. This is one of my favorite things about Connecticut. Fun fact number 2. In Connecticut, it takes about 10 constituents to get a legislator's attention. That means for us in Connecticut, truly each individual person does wield a lot of power, probably more than most people realize. And again, just that idea of all of us coming together and bringing our power together and harnessing it and moving forward together is really, it is powerful, and it is what it really gets stuff done. Next slide, please. So this session, as a community, how can partners and advocates engage? And these are the things that we are wanting to do. We want to build more power, right? We want to bring more people in. We want to bring in new voices, and also make sure that we're leveraging those experienced voices, people that have been with us for a while. As a community and as individuals, we want to make a plan, right? We want to know when things are going to happen so we can free ourselves up to get those things done. We want to understand a little bit of the timeline, right? And then again, stretch. Next slide, please. So one of the ways that we will be bringing people into the movement is partnering with you all and other supporters of the movement. And we would love for folks to host these informational house parties. They can be on the smaller side or they can be larger. But the idea is that we bring people together who care about this issue that have not yet engaged. And so at our end, we, bring the presentation, provide the information, and the host really just invites their friends and family and invites them into their home. So we would love it if folks here would be able to host or at least get some more information about that. And just so you know, these events can be virtual or in person. And if you're doing something in person, we can hook you up with a gift card to help with expenses for that event. Next slide, please. Okay, let's make a plan. Let's talk about dates and actions. Go ahead, Izzy. Thank you. Okay, this year, advocate lobbying is more important than ever, right? So we want to have a consistent presence in the Capitol and maybe a little bit the legislative office building. So we are going to amp up our grassroots lobbying or our advocacy lobbying. So we will do the historical lobbying that this community and this coalition has done, where different organizations come with their people and lobby for a particular day. I know that is absolutely part of what's been done historically. It is incredibly important, and we want to do that, but we want to add more. So the end of session is really where the action is. And so on Wednesdays, for the last, I think it's 5 Wednesdays, we would like to have groups of folks in the Capitol lobbying for the agenda that Ava will present to you at the next meeting. Having a consistent presence in the Capitol, it does a couple of things. First of all, it's a consistent communication to legislators that we are there, that people care about this, right? And it also lets them know that, okay, we're coming back. Like, this is so important that, like, we are making a commitment to show up and to show out. And so, yes, we will be amping up our advocacy in Hartford. And then just so you know, we will be trying to find ways to make sure that you have transportation, cover expenses, and other resources. Next slide. Public hearings, as most of you know, are tricky because we just don't know when they are. We won't know until the end of session, but when we know, you will know. Important to remember that hearings are really the only time in the legislative process where citizens can speak on the record. And you can provide written testimony, you can testify in person, and you can testify virtually. And those are all the ways folks can participate, as most of you know. Next slide, please. Thank you. Your success on lobby days and hearing days is important to us. It really is. Like, it's not just about the movement, but it's also about the experience folks have when they go up there. And so, as always, we will provide you with a written toolkit that you'll have. We'll also provide virtual trainings. We'll do some open office hours, which essentially means anyone that's doing hearings with us. I will say on Wednesday, for example, from 11 to 1, I'll have open office hours. Here's the link to drop in. And then we'll have like game day folders so that you have all the information that you need on site with you. And then, of course, staff will be present at the Capitol when you are as well. Next slide. This is important. So this is the part about stretching. So there is a direct relationship when it comes to advocacy, impact versus effort. And before I go on, I also recognize that different people have different capacity. And so I'm just very aware of that. So down here in this corner, we have the word petition, right? So petition is a very low effort action, and it oftentimes has a very low effort impact or low impact, right? Maybe in here, this is, writing letters, showing up to a rally. But right here at the tippy top, in-person meetings, those face-to-face conversations that we have with decision makers, that is the biggest bang for your buck. Like that is really, really where the magic can happen. So just keeping that, keep that in mind and keep that visual with you as we move through session. Next slide, please. This is my phone number and my email. You are welcome to contact me. I'll put this in the chat as soon as I'm done. Next slide, please. And that's it. Thank you. Oh, actually, that's not it. I am, although it's very late in the meeting, I am adding a sign up. I know it's very early in session, but this is all about the plan, right? And so when you open this sign up, you're going to see all the dates for lobbying. If you're like, okay, I definitely want to lobby, but I'm not sure which date I can choose, there's a comment, questions and comments at the bottom. Just let me know in there. Just let me know, like, I don't know when, but I know I want to. And there's the other actions or sign up parts in the sign up for those as well. And that is it. Thank you again.
All right, thanks. And you put all the docs and all of that will also be shared in the email that you get. Let's see, can we sign up on behalf of teams we lead? Yes, you can sign up. Yeah,
Yes.
sure. You can commit to them being there.
Yeah, that's awesome.
Yeah,
Put a note
great.
at the bottom that you're signing up for a team, so I know you're representing more than one person. That would be very helpful.
Yep.
And I will tell you a fun fact about me. One of the things that brings me the most amount of joy is when spreadsheets fill up with lots and lots of names. So that is my holiday wish, that we have a spreadsheet that starts to fill up. So thanks, guys.
Okay, great. Thank you so much, Terra. Ava, did you have anything else? We're all good. All right. We're only a few minutes over, but I hate being over. So I'm going to make sure that we wrap this up. I guess we are at the end of the year. There's quite a number of holidays coming up in the next few weeks. I hope everybody has a wonderful time marking them and that you get to spend time with friends and family and have a little bit of rest. It's a good season for that. I would like to just remind everyone that the January meeting will be on January 15th. And that is where we will have a legislative proposal to present to the group here. In the meantime, we'll send out all of those dates. It's going to be a busy legislative session. So, mark your dates, mark your calendars, and we'll send a lot of stuff out to you so that you can have clarity on your calendar. Thank you, everyone, so much. I guess that's it. Have a great night. Have a great time in the Dominican Republic, Maria.